Yep.
understand what happened with Freaknik, you got to understand what was happening, with like bass and the Olympics in '96,
Hmm.
all of these. So, and I'm an Atlanta native. I grew up there, so these are things that I saw kind of unfold from
Yeah.
my child perspective. But it was just that observation. It's like, okay, we're applying the wrong frame to understanding this music, and I also held that there's a lot of music that does that, a lot of music that's about kind of activating bodies, where, and it's been central to hip hop for a long time. In fact, arguably, hip hop starts in parties.
Of course.
And, so the kind of revolutionary audacity to be loud, to be present, to fill up space with your body and your voice, especially within the context of a world that's telling you to be quiet, that has value. So, yeah, I started arguing that back then.
Welcome to the Words Matter Pod with Akil Pinnock, a podcast dedicated to wordsmiths and storytellers. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to my homegirl Tiana at the Harvard Hip Hop Archive for putting this together, and thank you to the Harvard Hip Hop Archive for this collaboration. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to Assistant Professor of Critical Music Studies at SUNY Stony Brook University, Dr. Kevin C. Holt, one of the 2024-2025 Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellows. Mr. Holt holds a PhD in ethnomusicology and an MA in African American Studies from Columbia University. He holds a bachelor's in music and classical performance on double bass, as you can see right behind him, if you're watching the video, from Oberlin College and Conservatory of Music, and is the creator of the fellowship project, I Bet You Won't Get Crunk, the performative resistance of Atlanta hip hop party music. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great, man. Yeah, thanks again for sitting down with me. I noticed these conversations started around December, and we did schedule one date, but I was trying to schedule all three of you guys, but it's all
All
good.
three, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. Everybody's different part of the globe. Uh,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah, it's all good. I'll get those guys later. Have you? Are you in communication with them?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You need me to,
No, no, no. It's all good.
to help facilitate.
I was just asking. Yeah, is what
Yeah.
not really sure like your relationship with them, but you know, uh, thanks again for sitting down with me.
Oh no, absolutely. It sounds like it's a great podcast, and I'm happy to make a contribution.
Thanks again. Do you ever think about how a fellowship at a prestigious and world-renowned university like Harvard is named after a rapper from a New York City public housing project?
Yeah, do I ever just think about the enormity of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's incredible. I teach a music and culture of hip hop course every year at Stony Brook. And one of the things that I really like emphasize for them is that all that we know of hip hop culture, it grew from, black and brown, poor and working class kids
Mm-hmm.
who were, pulling from, they're using old music tech, right? They're not using the latest music tech. They are, occupying public space. They're in the subway system, and from that and just their sheer like grit and creativity, they created something that really shook the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this as kind of just an extension of that. I I was low key. I really was hoping like one day I was just going to meet Nas, like he just walked through the program. Didn't happen, but I wonder what that was like for him. The enormity of having um, a university with the sort of prestige of a Harvard University. Call upon his name. To foster more research in hip hop. So I think it's a beautiful thing. I I I also, I'm very mindful that uh, I that many of the mechanisms that led to the early hip hop, the beginning of it, they're still kind of happening. There are still, poor and working class black and brown kids that are doing amazing, innovative stuff with hip hop.
Hmm.
So, while we pay attention to and celebrate, the fact that there is hip hop discourse happening at Harvard,
Yeah.
I love to keep in mind that there's still like hip hop discourse happening, in sort of the grassroots space.
Mm. I'm glad you brought that last point up because I feel like recently there's been, well, that I've been seeing just a lot of division in how hip hop is perceived, as far
Mm.
as like hip hop, how it's perceived in academia, and how hip hop is perceived in the streets where it comes from, and it's almost like this kind of elitism with people who work in academia, who judge the music, who analyze it, maybe in not the same way that people in the hood are doing it,
Yeah,
and oftentimes people in the hood who this music really represents don't have their opinions valued in the same way.
right. Yeah. So first off, that hits very close to home as somebody who's doing work on Crunk. Because that was not, especially when I started, that was not necessarily seen as the type of music that that calls for, academic inquiry, right? The idea was that there's been kind of not a lot of attention paid to like party music
Yeah,
or things that are about embodiment. That's something that's big, and um, and so often you miss really, important and significant things. So I'm going to say a couple of things. The first thing is the acknowledgement that increasingly academia is getting folks who grew up in the hood and grew up as like children of hip hop, right?
yeah,
More, and that's because of, barriers that have come down and, um, opportunities offered to folks from poor and working class backgrounds, still not in the strength that they should be, and we'll see what the future holds with
yeah,
everything that's going down. But so that leads to more and more academics having the perspective of coming into contact with hip hop from a space of love and primary education first, not
yeah,
necessarily getting to a doctoral space and deciding I'm going to, apply some literary theory to this thing called hip hop. Um, but through that, we get space for new frames, right?
yeah,
We get space for new kinds of analyses because as time goes on, it's inevitable that there's going to be some style of music that older folks don't get, right? Somebody's going to be like, I don't get the appeal of this music.
hmm,
I don't understand it.
always, yeah.
And yeah,
I said always.
yeah. And so, in order to keep that discourse going, when these younger folks who have like an intuitive connection, they're very much like, I understand it viscerally. I understand the appeal of this. I'm doing work with this. I'm doing self-making work with it, especially. Um, they're the ones who create kind of the new frames for understanding, what this means. Um, so that is my optimistic arc for academic discourse, that if it's working the way that it should work, folks with the new perspectives and the new ideas, including people who are who have frames for understanding that are unfamiliar to what's already happening in the academy, they bring that in. I want to say that I love that you described what folks like who listen to hip hop or grew up with hip hop, I love that you describe their work as analysis, right? Because that's one thing that's important.
Yeah.
Everybody analyzes, everybody theorizes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that's unique to academia,
Yeah.
but not everybody gets the same platform to share that analysis.
Yeah.
Um, one of the reasons, I'm an ethnographer by trade, and one of the reasons why I like doing that work is because I really get to, put the theory and analysis that I get from the people I speak to in conversation with the theory and the analysis that gets published in a book for X, Y, and Z reason. Um, uh, so as far as disconnects go, you're gonna have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Mm-hmm.
a little inevitable. I will say, academia has its own kind of contours, and sometimes it takes a little bit. It takes a little bit to catch up to the way that people are analyzing, in real time in real life, right? Um, but I again, optimistically, that disconnect is more of a lag than, a real antagonistic relationship.
Yeah.
And I say that with the acknowledgement that folks absolutely can and do weaponize the space of academia
Yeah.
against other types of thinkers. Um, but yeah.
When you say lag, do you mean lag as in they caught on late?
Oh yeah, academia catches on late.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
It just does. It moves kind of slow. And, as again, kind of a reflection of that, I'm doing work on Crunk. It's probably going to be, my book is probably going to be the first book that's focused on Crunk. Crunk was a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Crunk was a while ago.
Over 20
And,
years.
yeah, yeah, ooh, yeah. And you know, and I started, talking about Crunk in an academic context first, probably about 15-ish years ago. Right. And so, there was space to have that conversation in academia, even though it was kind of, a little rootless at the time. Um, so, academia just it takes a while to, get the letters behind your name or
Mm-hmm.
in front of your name if you want by the doctor. It takes time to, do the conferences and build your network, build up your resources. It takes time to write. It
Mm-hmm.
takes time to write something. And popular culture just moves very fast, and it's moving faster and faster because of, our our relationship to like social media and how that's impacted the pacing of things. And you're just gonna have somebody who's a little behind. It's very rare that you come across somebody who is, you know, at the age where they are kind of in the midst or in the middle
Yeah.
of something new happening, and they're also positioned um, to kind of expedite that into an academic space. That being said, academia isn't the only place where this type of critical discussion can happen.
Yeah.
It happens in journalism. It happens in opinion pieces. It's happening in memes. So
It's happening in
uh,
oh, my fault. You continue.
no, go on.
No, yeah, I'm saying it's happening where just everyday people are. It's happening in the cafeteria. It's happening in the student union in the college. It's happening
Yeah,
uh at the barbershop.
absolutely, all those spaces. And I think as long as we kind of big picture it and we acknowledge all of these as important, valid, and critical conversations, um, not to, I'm in academia, so I'm not like bashing it, but, not to put it on too high of a pedestal. It's just part of a conversation that is broad and far reaching and has many contours. Yeah.
Hmm. And just to go back to like my first question, it's just the irony that someone who I don't even think he finished ninth grade has a fellowship named after him at the most famous university, I would say, in the world, most famous prestigious university in the world that he would have no chance of getting into, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really wild. But I think it's also, we have certain culturally ingrained ideas about brilliance. And, if you for the folks who spend a lot of time with people who um who are navigating the world in a way that comes with systemic barriers, I'll say euphemistically.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that brilliance never really gets the acknowledgement. And we're entering into a time, or we are occupying a time, where we're kind of rethinking the assumption that uh, the most brilliant among us must necessarily dwell between, amongst the most privileged among us.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying we're occupying the time. I corrected myself because, Du Bois was saying that 100 years ago,
Mm.
120 years ago, you know. Um, but that's it's a testament to how brilliant Nas is as a creator, as an artist, as a lyricist. He has had a pointed impact on hip hop. Within the context, of hip hop has changed the world, it's changed music, has changed culture,
Yeah.
and to not acknowledge that on the foundation that um, he didn't take a traditional kind of educational route is a blatant denial of that type of brilliance. And I'm happy it's not happening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that hip hop is starting to get the respect that it deserves as an intellectual art form. And we're having this conversation. I think Dochi said something recently about hip hop. Anyone who doesn't see it as intelligent, I'm paraphrasing, but anyone who doesn't see it as intelligent is like racist, anti-black, because look at the literary elements in a rap song. Look at the double entendres, the wittiness, I mean, think about certain lines that I bring up this example of Kendrick on Euphoria when he
Mhm.
says in 8 bars I'll explain that phrase, and then 8 bars later he explains why he said what he just said. It's like, if you can't acknowledge that in an academic sense and really divulge on that and do research that you can explain it to the masses who are just unfamiliar, like if you can do that with a form of music, then it has value in academia.
Yeah, yeah. In addition to just its value, it is truly complex. And I say this with a broad stroke. There's all sorts of hip hop that's doing all sorts of things. But the folks who, on their face or on its face, kind of dismiss hip hop culture, hip hop music, hip hop, lyricism as less than, but for the fact of, its inherent blackness, its roots, can something that is, so complex and has all of these different ways of analyzing, the music or analyzing the culture, right? There are so many different ways, but for the fact of the blackness, right? Is it so easily dismissed? Um, and yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is, I think that that such a broad dismissal, right, which has been inherent and from hip hop detractors from the very beginning. The idea that hip hop culture is inherently antisocial or that it's anti-intellectual. It's always been kind of leveraged against or attacked. That was the attack against hip hop culture. Um, we saw a lot of that sort of rhetoric levied against Kendrick Lamar after his,
Super Bowl
Super Bowl
performance, yeah.
halftime performance. The idea that his music is unintelligible, or that,
Yeah, I didn't understand anything he was saying.
right. I was like, and that's wild. Especially, within the context of the world has like punk rock and heavy metal, all sorts of things where you literally can't hear what they're saying, but nobody's saying that these don't have the right to exist, right? So, it's very much intertwined with historical attacks against the contributions of Black people,
Yeah.
right? It's the same story, kind of revamped. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I got into um, being somebody who researches music from a cultural standpoint. You know, so much of who who people are gets kind of metaphorized through their music,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, as a connection to that, an attack on music that is symbolically aligned with a group of people is a way of like dog whistling or attacking those
Yep.
people. Um, so, that's one of the things that kind of really inspires me. And another thing is, again, historically, in hip hop certainly, but before, there is so much that is put into the music, so much so that if it's not done quite right, like even if all of the elements are there, like
Yeah.
syncopated, or the lyrics, if it's not quite right, it's not doing the same work. It's not doing the right thing.
Yep.
And people who are kind of keyed into the aesthetic, they feel that it's not quite right.
Yeah, they know that
Uh,
something's missing.
right. And that in itself, it speaks to all of the varied work that gets done in this music and through it. Yeah. So all that is to say is, yeah, there's a long shadow of historic, systemic dismissal and attacking of Black people and their contributions, and that gets bound up with a constant sort of aesthetic attack, right, or the dismissal of hip hop as an art form or as a music.
Thank you, man. We could really go on this entire episode about that specific topic, but I want to I want to get to who you are a little bit. So who are you?
Oh, that's okay. Where to start? I mean, yeah, you said that as you mentioned in the intro, I began as a performing musician, right, as a bassist, and I got into academia kind of not haphazardly, but it wasn't a straightforward path. So after I graduated from Oberlin Conservatory in college, I also did Africana Studies as a double major. I was doing kind of the musician thing. I was in a band. I was playing with symphony. I was doing some studio work. I was gigging around. I didn't have anything super solid, but I was being a musician. And on kind of a whim, I applied to grad school.
Mm.
And I applied to Columbia for their master's program in Africana
It's a big
Studies.
whim, the biggest whim.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I say whim because I was like, I'll either like I'm gonna apply, I'll see what happens. If that doesn't work out, then I'm gonna just do something else as a musician. Um, Actually, well, what's funny? I don't know if this story will ever get back to her, but at the time, like I said, I was gigging around, and there was an artist who was like up and coming, and she was performing around. I loved her music, and I saw that she didn't have a bass player, so I was just on the low, kind of learning some of her stuff. I was like, if grad school doesn't work out, I'm gonna go try to be her bass player. But it was Janelle Monáe, and she kind of
Oh
blew up
wow.
like right after that. So I was like, yeah. And that's not to say that I would have been her bassist, because who knows? But I was like, yeah, I'm just throwing whatever at the wall to see what sticks. And and the reason why I applied to Columbia, uh, years before that, I had done a little research project on African American classical composers, and I was noticing a lot went through Columbia. Turns out it was Columbia's teacher college. I didn't really know the difference, but so Columbia had been kind of in the back of my mind, like, okay, I'll see what I can do, if I get out there. So I applied, didn't know what type of applicant I was, and I got in there. Um, and when I first started, I think I said I was going to do a thesis on uh, the uh, the impact that the transatlantic slave trade had on classical music aesthetics.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I was like, oh yeah, because there's more direct connection now with the sub-Saharan African music that has an impact on the aesthetics of what's happening in the symphony, going from the Baroque era into the Romantic era. That's what I got admitted on. When I got there, um, I wound up taking more than a few courses that kind of centered on popular music, which I was interested in, and I
yeah.
was also just kind of in the world as a musician. Most of the studio work I did was kind of hip hop oriented, but one of the things that I noticed was most of the analysis that we were getting was just kind of lyrical analysis that kind of equated hip hop music to the complexity of its poetry. And that's an important part, but it's not the only part. Right. And because uh, so many people I was reading were kind of jumping off of the idea that hip hop with these beautifully complex lyrics is, where its core value is, they would occasionally point to like, well, music like crunk or like bounce, it's not, it's kind of dangerous to hip hop because it's mostly repetitive.
Yeah.
It's not poetically as interesting or as complex. And so I was kind of like, well, yeah, but that misses, the that misses what that music's doing, what it's trying to do. Right. So that wound up being my thesis. I was like, well, to understand Crunk, then you got to understand what happened with Freaknik. And to
Mm-hmm. Yep.
understand what happened with Freaknik, you got to understand what was happening, with like bass and the Olympics in '96,
Mm-hmm.
all of these. So, and I'm an Atlanta native. I grew up there, so these are things that I saw kind of unfold from
Yeah.
my child perspective. But it was just that observation. It's like, okay, we're applying the wrong frame to understanding this music. And I also held that there's a lot of music that does that, a lot of music that's about kind of activating bodies, where, and it's been central to hip hop for a long time. In fact, arguably, hip hop starts in parties.
Of course.
And, so the kind of revolutionary audacity to be loud, to be present, to fill up space with your body and your voice, especially within the context of a world that's telling you to be quiet, that has value. So yeah, I started arguing that back then. And another kind of whim adjacent thing, I applied to doctoral programs.
Another
Um,
big whim.
Another, yeah, I mean, because again, I was like, I was applying to ethnomusicology programs, and I had honestly never, I had taken one ethnomusicology course at that point, and I was like, hey, maybe I get in, maybe I don't, I'll figure it out. um, but I got into some, and I also wasn't sure what type of applicant I was, because again, I didn't have necessarily that type of perspective, or how to place myself within the discourse or within the world. And part of that's probably, residual how I felt like I was placed in the world from a very young age.
Yeah.
Neither here nor there. Um, but I applied, I got in, wound up choosing to stay at Columbia, but go to the music department, and took a slight, side mission because I had to do another, master's thesis. Did mine on amateur night at the Apollo, which was so much fun.
Yeah, I could
I was just,
imagine.
yeah, I was just always at the Apollo. The people at the Apollo knew my face.
Oh wow.
They'd be like, "Oh, here he comes again." So yeah, I was there like every week. Um, but when it came time to work on the dissertation, I went back to Crunk because I was like, more needs to be said, and yeah, I've been kind of that's been my entry point, or kind of the way that I entered hip hop academia, or hip hop studies, as opposed to being somebody who grew up as a fan of hip hop, who just happens to be in academic space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, let me tell you something. We need people like you, right? Because um there's a lot of white men in your space who in academia who discuss hip hop, who analyze it, and I'm not mad at that at all because I think we need everyone to, like I said earlier, we need everyone to, um, if you really love this art form, you really love this culture, then it should be articulated to the masses about why it's
Mhm.
important. But the fact that you're a black person from Atlanta, a city that's so important to black people, in America, really, and a city that has dominated hip hop for over 20 years, and a city that whose hip hop legacy is controversial in many ways, specifically in the early aughts and in the late 90s, when Atlanta really started to get a lot of attention musically. So it's important that people like you are in these spaces academically to really, I mean, I hate to say validity because I hate to, make it sound like you got to go to white people spaces to get some validation. But, when people see that a black man who has a doctorate is articulating and really showing why the things that we created when we had nothing is valuable, is something that I would have never imagined as a child.
Mm. Yeah, I will say, and maybe this is a weird thing, but I honestly I cherish the privilege of being able to do what I do. Um, Early, when I was first getting into collegiate teaching, and I think this was like right after I graduated. I was teaching a seminar. It was an undergraduate seminar that was an introduction to African American music, and at the end of it, there were three young black men who came to me, and they told me that I was their first black male educator.
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh, here? You like here at the school?" And they were like, "Nah, in life." And first off, I realized that I had a privilege that I wasn't aware of, because I did have I had black men educators, kind of growing up. I was never in a situation where I didn't see a broad spectrum for who I could be on the basis of the role models, or the people who were in my community. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful to potentially be that for somebody. And I love that I turned my interest and my passion for music into a career, even if it's not quite the career I expected it to be.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I'm going to play music and I'm never going to read. Like, that was my plan. I was like, and I'm doing like kind of the opposite. I still, play every once in a while, but um, but what I love most about being the educator part of the gig, right, is that I get to make space for students to build their own connections, right? Because you know, college students, most people, they have very passionate and very specific ideas about their music, and its value and what it does for them. But folks don't always have specific language to articulate how or why it's significant to them, right? Or a space to understand how some music that they don't necessarily connect to might be significant for somebody else. That's one reason why so often conversations about music in the public sphere it just kind of boils down to this is good, it's objectively good,
Hmm.
it's brilliant. If you don't hear it, there's something wrong with you, you
Yeah,
know. So
that sounds like that sounds like Instagram comments.
yeah, yeah. um, so just being able to tease through that with students, like, all right, I'm going to lay out some tools of analysis for you. You pick what works for you. You may come up with a new concept that discusses the value of a music that's really important to you that maybe didn't exist before. Like, if somebody was doing a lot of self-making work with mumble rap, it's not a whole lot of work on mumble rap right now.
Mm.
um at the very least, mumble rap absolutely needs its own set of tools
Yeah, that's a
because you
fact.
can't, yeah, you can't just, pull the tools that you were using to analyze, a Biggie song and project it onto mumble rap because they're doing very different things in a
Exactly.
very different way. And somebody out there understands that intuitively and knows that, well, when people are connecting to this music, they're listening for this thing or that thing. They're listening for its timbre. They're listening for all of these interesting things that production is doing, which, from my perspective, when rap was big, I heard connections to like Parliament Funkadelic, other like
Hmm.
we're experimenting with vocals, we're experimenting with production and resonance, and all of that kind of flies under the radar if you're not keyed into if you're focused just on like melody, harmony, lyrics,
Yeah.
right? So, but again, somebody grew up listening to mumble rap and they are well positioned in it and they can speak to all of those nuances that I probably can't hear. And I love just kind of laying out the platform and letting students kind of, you know, they have their ideas, right? I want them to be able to articulate their ideas with the best tools that we have available and create new tools if those
Yeah.
aren't working.
It's definitely going to be interesting seeing in the future what the younger generation is going to do academically, or maybe not just academically, like maybe in a documentary or something, to talk about the music of their era that you and I may not really be privy to and have the language um, to really cover. So that that'd be interesting. A mumble rap, kind of like I bet you won't get crunk, but for mumble rap.
Right. Right. It'd be the Young Thug Fellowship of mumble rap studies. You never know.
At Emory
Um,
University.
and it absolutely, and I love that. I accept that as things change, there's a bigger and bigger chance that something's going to happen musically or culturally that it'll be hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I hope I have the self awareness and the grace to say somebody else should lead this conversation. Like, this is, I'm there to support the direction of the conversation. It's not for me to try to speak over the folks who know this music better than I do.
Yeah, yeah. As you get older, the world no longer is your world, and you got to accept that.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the description of I bet you won't get crunk on the Hip Hop Archive website. The project is described as you arguing throughout the project that participants in Atlanta's evolving hip hop party scene manifested political resistance through composition and dance by emphasizing performative and embodied facets of socio musical participation. What about Crunk influence political resistance, and can political resistance exist in music and really anywhere else if those who are expected to resist don't have an idea of what's happening around to even know what institutional
Mm,
power they need to resist?
yeah, I'll tackle that question first because that is it's a question that kind of haunts a little bit. It's like, am I projecting too much onto? Because I remember what it was like to like go out there, throw balls, get crunk.
Yeah,
I wasn't saying let me overthrow the oppressive system by shaking my dreads, um, but
that kind of reminds me.
I also
Sorry,
oh go on, yeah.
there's a new Drake song on on the album with Party Next Door where he's talking about Kendrick. He's like saying the subliminal, saying like our girl's gonna be throwing ass to a dictionary.
uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, and yeah, I get it. And I think that also speaks, reflects a little bit that disconnect that we were talking about sometimes between the academy and the people. But that's kind of for everything. Like sometimes things become much clearer in retrospect, right? Um, this came out like a lot with discussions about Freaknik. People were going down to Freaknik to have a good time,
Exactly.
right? But so much about Freaknik was about kind of claiming space. And, this is at a time where, the nation had kind of accepted youth vacationing, as kind of a normal part of being that 18 to 22-year-old
Yep.
person, uh, if you recall back then, MTV had, spring break and blah, blah, blah. Maybe I'm dating myself, but, there were, it was just kind of an accepted thing for young people. But Freaknik wasn't framed that way. Freaknik was seen as, they were described as invaders who were creating problems.
Mm.
And the people who were participating in Freaknik, they did things like they made t-shirts that said, you can't stop the cruising. They insisted on being loud. They insisted on being present. And again, at the time, it might have just felt like we're partying, and also there's a little spite here because we're being treated differently because of who we are and how we're occupying space. But looking back, with all of the things that are kind of surrounding it, it becomes a political gesture, not even from the intention of the people involved, but because of the people on the outside who are reacting to it, from a politics of erasure. That's kind of what politicizes that insistence. And that's a little bit of, what I'm kind of getting at with I Bet You Won't Get Crunk, right? Because, you know, Atlanta through the 90s had kind of like a bright party hip hop sound. Like Atlanta was very bass oriented. And right around the time Freaknik kind of gets squashed because of policies and hypervigilant policing, like everything that could happen, and those mechanisms maintained throughout the year. Like it's concentrated in Freaknik, but by creating policies that make, for instance, cruising illegal, right?
Yeah,
Riding around with your car at a certain below a certain speed is made illegal.
that's crazy.
Or now we have kind of a policy infrastructure that can be used to criminalize some of the behaviors we see around the clubs and that we see in certain places. That creates a situation where throughout the year there's kind of attack is maybe strong, but attack kind of fits, on just this facet of not just musical culture, but Black culture and leisure time in general. And that's around the time that we start to shift from a bass sound to a crunk sound,
Mm-hmm.
really. Which, by the way, I acknowledge in the book, most of what we get from, in terms of like the sound of crunk and the structure of crunk, a lot of that's rooted in Memphis. Another thing that we don't quite talk about are the invisible connections between all these places, because
Yeah.
New Orleans, Memphis, Miami, they're all kind of bleeding into like Atlanta's hip hop sound because people are traveling through those places
Yep.
for recreational purposes. Um, but yeah, so the question I posed then was like, well, at the very moment where you got all this policing happening around Black youth vacation culture, suddenly it becomes about, being full throated and screaming, a chant along with everybody else. Suddenly, it becomes even more about looking rowdy and kind of moshing. Suddenly it becomes that, and it's connecting to a lot of people. That's the other important element. It's not just that the music is doing that, but people are invested in it and they're putting in work to get crunk.
Yeah.
And
It's like a
that it
sport.
spoke to, right. And the fact that it spoke to so many people, to me, says that the significance of that intervention was something that was important. Maybe not even on a fully conscious level. Like, again, everybody's not like, I'm gonna get crunk for the revolution, but on a level where it's like, this feels like something I need to express. This feels like, I'm gonna jump in this pit. Like, something needs to happen, right? And then with time, and again, a little retrospect, um, we have the space to kind of talk about like, well, actually, we were doing something interesting. We were doing something cool, and we were doing something that was important. We didn't know, but Crunk wound up having an impact on the music that came after it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so yeah, that's kind of what I'll say for that. It's not necessarily that this music is built with that sort of intention, especially from all the participants. But that doesn't mean that it's not there, and that doesn't mean that it's not its impact. And very, very importantly, again, the politicization from the outside. The folks who are saying that consistently throughout this, that in leisure time, young Black people should be unseen and unheard.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
This absolutely pushes against that. And it pushes against that, uh, I argue, in a way that's really just kind of reclaiming the right to be a carefree young person, to be that person who is, I'm here to have fun, or I'm here to fill the voice. I'm here because uh, I am also, a part of this community, not to be erased or not to be,
Yeah.
especially in terms of, in reference to Freaknik, not here as an invader. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where I arrived on that.
And I think it's kind of poetic that the epicenter of this is Atlanta, which is in the South, obviously, and the South is portrayed to be a little bit more conservative than a
Mm,
lot of other parts of America. So, it's kind of like a juxtaposition with Atlanta being the South being conservative and this, like super upbeat um music that doesn't really have rules existing
mm,
there. Along with, you know, uh it ties into everything, the 96 Olympics and white flight
mm,
and
mm.
you know, uh what was
The Atlanta child murders,
the
even like
Atlanta
I bring
child
that
murders,
in.
yep. Exactly.
Yeah,
So it's kind of like it's almost like a rebirth for Atlanta.
yeah, yeah. It's um, one of the things that I get into, because there are all these kind of like constructions of what the South is, who the South is, right? All throughout, there are, I mean, we can honestly take it back to like birth of a nation, you know, uh, uh, yeah, terrible. But the there is, or say there are factors that kind of imagine the South as A, very white, B, very conservative, and C, kind of nostalgic in a way that erases how harrowing, living in the South during Jim Crow or during the era of enslavement really was for non-white people. Um, and all throughout, you had folks who were, especially Black people from the South and in the South, who were kind of recasting what the South could be, what it could sound like. So, first off, there's kind of a parallel story of most genres that become symbolically aligned with Black folks over the past century, even a little beyond, have been associated with the South in some way.
Yep.
Blues, jazz coming out of New Orleans, soul. Even the roots of rock and roll. Everybody's kind of like the roots are in the South. Um, Interestingly, hip hop is probably one of the few where that's not the case.
Where does it come
Where
from the
no,
South?
yeah, I couldn't hear you.
You said where it doesn't like come from the South.
Where the myth isn't that it comes from the South, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
I'm just talking about the way that people talk about its origins.
yeah.
Nobody, but you have folks that are kind of recasting our idea of like what the South could be, right? I'm thinking about um, folks who kind of evoked the South as kind of uh, protest music. And I know this isn't the original version, but Mary Clayton doing Southern Man and also doing Sweet Home Alabama. That's just a real, encapsulation
Yeah.
of what it means to be kind of navigating space in the South, or also creating the South as a home space. The way that we get from Gladys Knight, Midnight Train to Georgia.
It's a great migration
Um,
song.
right. It's a remigration song. They're
Yeah.
like, well, that's enough of LA. I'm going to
Yeah.
Georgia. Like, it's and throughout you've had folks who complicate the story, that romanticizing narrative, that one that seeks to uh, recast the history of the South as something that is disconnected from some really abhorrent things, right? You have folks who have insisted on, let's say, the stakes of, and this goes back to like, Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit or Nina Simone singing Mississippi Goddamn, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is, I say all this to say that Southern hip hop kind of broadly had this project, especially in the 90s, of really kind of playing with this idea of what does it mean to be from the South and to be a hip hopper, right? Are we going to go with like a romanticized, like home type of regathering, like Arrested Development in Tennessee?
Mm.
Are we going to talk about, the South as a dirty space, which we get from Goody Mob, like
Yeah.
what you really know about the dirty South? Are we going to think of the South as kind of a cosmic otherwise, outcasts, AT aliens? Or are we going to like get here and think about the South through the way that we are interacting with each other and connecting to each other in a very kind of intimate party space? And that winds up being a lot of, I mean, again, it's Memphis Buck, it's Bounce, it's Miami Bass, it's Crunk. Like all of those things are kind of about being present in space, in place, in time, and like interacting with the folks around you who are also there with you. Um, and that, like I said, it challenges those well-worn narratives about Southern gentility, right? Uh, it denies that sort of simplistic construction
Yeah,
of what it means to be in the South. And honestly, it's that addition is much more reflective of the complexities of Southern spaces and the negotiations of what Southern identity is.
yeah, yeah. Hip hop definitely helped change the perception of the South for sure. Because I don't think that many, even though most Black people in America have roots in the South, um, unless you're of like a Black immigrant, um, but most Black people come from the South. But there is, I think, over the decades, in the aftermath of the Great Migration, a lot of people lost touch with that. So they really forgot or just really had no idea of what the South was like because they maybe weren't traveling there, and um, ancestors died over time. Uh, I
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Also, not to downplay, one thing whenever I do like a course on, the history of popular music and how music kind of relates to race, I always point to the fact that there was a time in this nation's history where blackface minstrelsy was
the most popular
the
genre of art.
it was the biggest export, and it,
Yeah.
it stayed that way. Cultural export, the and arguably the first cultural export of the nation. And for a long time, that was the dominant narrative of what Black Southernness was. And which is why it becomes so important that you have folks coming in and retooling the narrative for their own purposes. And not, I mean, it is significant and important that you have, again, our Mississippi Goddamn, but also that you have Ray Charles doing Georgia on My Mind. It's both of those things.
Mm,
This is, a space of love where we foster things, where we, connected to people. This is a space where uh, oppressive regimes were so ubiquitous that we really had to adjust our reality to just survive how to move through the space. I sometimes think about I have a great uncle who's no longer with us, but when I was in college, he would always tell me, you have to get gas in this area because you can't stop in this city or this city or this city when you're driving back to school,
mm.
right? Because he grew up in the era,
He give you them green book
arguably.
directions.
Well, he was, sundown towns, which
Yeah.
I think recently somebody was still talking about sundown towns in Alabama. But that was his relationship to the space was fundamentally impacted by what it meant to grow up in that era. And he's giving me survival tactics that at the time I was like, that's like, sure, I'll do it. But you're being looking back, I'm like, whew, glad I listened. Because you
True.
never know, you know. But yeah, it's so that's one of the things that I try to keep in mind, and especially just going off of my great uncle, Uncle William. Um, he had those strategies for the places where he had to avoid, but he came back for the family reunion, right? It's those types of dualisms, those types of nuances that really speak to what it means to kind of grow up in the South. And you have artists that express that more directly, like Goody Mob, I think is a good example of that. And you have scholars that address it directly, like Regina Bradley, like brilliant, on that. But you also have people who are just giving you, a fragment of that experience, and Crunk is part of that experience.
Yep.
It's, it is there's never been anything that Black folks have gone through where there was no space for. some sort of celebration, where there was no space for getting down, for alleviating, for reconnecting to humanity
Yep.
through that exertion of, of maybe it's joy, maybe it's anger, something, something kind of celebratory, something kind of party-ish, if you will. And yeah, that's, you know, from the broad scope, that's one of the reasons why I think discussing something like Crunk is important. We kind of sometimes in hip hop studies we forget the party.
Yep, that's true. Everything can't be at the end of the day it's music, and music isn't just words and lyricism. Like, music is sounds, and how you react to those sounds, and how you enjoy yourself with the sounds. And I think hip hop fans have lost that sometimes.